2018. In Nicaragua, protesters are beaten off the streets. Unarmed students are shot dead. This Central American country has had more than its fair share of violence. But what shocks Nicaraguans now is the person behind this brutal suppression. Daniel Ortega, president of Nicaragua for a fourth term, and his vice president and wife, Rosario Murillo. 35 years earlier, in July 1979, Ortega had been the hero, a dashing Marxist revolutionary whose Sandinista guerrilla force had overthrown the fascistic Somoza regime and entered Managua in triumph.
The mood in Central America after the Nicaraguan revolution is that it inspires a lot of hope. So there's a lot of belief in that there will be soon another revolution and that this is a moment of change for the entire region.
But there are some, both within and outside of Nicaragua, who are not celebrating this revolution.
But then also it inspires a lot of fear in anti-communists and people who believe this is part of a global war on communism that they are losing.
In the 1980s, Russian and Cuban money is supporting Ortega's Sandinista government. Meanwhile, American President Ronald Reagan funnels money to right-wing Contra-rebels fighting an insurgency against the Sandinista government, leading to one of the greatest scandals ever to hit the White House, the Iran-Contra affair.
Reagan was a signed-up believer in the domino theory. He worried that when one country goes communist, it won't be too long before a neighboring country goes communist as well.
Ronald Reagan was already secretly helping Nicaragua's neighbor, the El Salvadoran government. Why was the leader of the free world secretly supporting brutal dictators? What was the lasting legacy of this Cold War fought on Central American soil? Central America, a land bridge that connects the continents of North and South. Her position gives her access to both the Pacific Ocean and the seas of the Caribbean. A place of great natural beauty, home to rainforests, volcanoes, and long sandy beaches. In the 16th century, it was taken by the Spanish, who ruled here for over 300 years. For Nicaragua and El Salvador, the liberalism that follows Spanish rule does not bring the freedoms and success that people expect. Things get worse. Although there is a surge in exports of commodities like coffee and bananas, most of her citizens get poorer because the spoils of this trade are not shared fairly.
Central America has been dominated by large landed estates since colonial times, but really that unequal system of a tiny minority of the population owning most of the wealth and the land, while the majority lived in dire poverty, was really entrenched in the early 20th century.
El Salvador, 1932. The people are fed up with the greed of the ruling classes. The workers struggle to survive. This starving, poor majority work to line the pockets of a few families at the top. The conditions are ripe for a revolution, and that's exactly what happens. 15 years since Lenin's Red Army imposed communism in Russia. This is the first Bolshevik revolution in the Americas. An army of peasants and indigenous people rise up against the ruling classes. They want a socialist society. El Salvador's president, Hernández Martínez, suppresses this rebellion. He tells his army to do what they have to. In just 6 days, they kill tens of thousands of people. The outcome becomes known as La Matanza, the slaughter.
The massacre of 1932 was really a seminal moment in El Salvador's history. For the left, it was partly a heroic failure, but it was also evidence of the intransigence and the cruelty of the elite of the oligarchy. But for the rich, for conservatives, was an averted communist revolution, and they remained terrified of the possibility that there would be a popular uprising, a so-called communist uprising. And so from 1932 onwards, you saw a series of military governments. The military were always on hand to repress any popular movement, any protests or any type of dissent.
In neighboring Nicaragua in the 1930s, there is also rebellion. Here too, there is a huge disparity in wealth, and America is in on the game.
The United States historically has wanted cheap land, cheap labor, access to strategic resources, wants Latin American markets, and typically right-wing, free market, conservative governments, authoritarian governments have suited US interests.
US commercial interests have taken control of Nicaragua's national rail company, and US Marines remain in the country. They first landed on her beaches in 1909, when 2 US officers were amongst 500 revolutionaries executed by President Zelaya. Many Nicaraguans see this as a threat to their national sovereignty. Guerrilla fighter Augusto Cesar Sandino leads an insurgency which attacks the US Marines. While his group have no great military success, he manages to evade capture and become something of a hero. US Marines leave Nicaragua in 1933. 1 year later, in 1934, President Zelaya invites Sandino to a peace conference. But when he left the presidential palace, he was killed on the orders of Anastasio Somoza, head of the National Guard. His position as a martyr and hero to the Nicaraguan people is guaranteed. And his name will live on through a guerrilla movement that finds inspiration in his fight for sovereignty and national autonomy, the Sandinistas.
When the struggle against the Somoza regime started, the Sandinistas, they used Sandino as kind of a way to bind the nation together. So they portrayed their own struggle against the Somoza regime as a continuation of Sandino's struggle against the US occupation.
By 1979, the Somoza dynasty had ruled Nicaragua for 44 years. From the outset, they consolidated their power.
Their main source of power was their relation with the National Guard, which was kind of like their private police force or army, which they used to control the country.
Thanks to investments, land confiscations, bribes, and illegal exports, the Somoza family are one of the richest in the region.
The Sandinistas would say that the Somoza dynasty used Nicaragua as kind of their own farm, as their own backyard, and to enrich themselves.
Young guerrilla fighter Daniel Ortega has been getting military and ideological training in Cuba since 1974. Now, he's returned to Nicaragua, and he's about to lead an uprising. In 1979, Ortega is one of the leaders of the Sandinista National Liberation Front, or FSLN. They take to the streets and in a bloody 45-day struggle overthrow the Somoza dynasty. The new socialist government sets about dismantling the riches of the Somoza clan and nationalizes industry. They abolish the oppressive National Guard. The Sandinista police force will instead be the guardians of people's happiness. For the Nicaraguan people, this sounds like the end of a nightmare and the beginning of a fairer and brighter future.
Everyone was very excited to become part of this revolutionary project, which was going to make the country a better place for everyone.
But there is no celebration at the White House. They are reeling at the prospect of a strong Soviet and Castro-backed government in Nicaragua, bringing communism into Central America and perilously close to US borders. They will scheme and fight to bring the Sandinistas down. American eyes are on Nicaragua. By the 1970s, Central America was pulled into the Cold War. Money is flooding in to help left-wing revolutionaries from Fidel Castro and the Soviet Union. America can't stand idly by. The White House sanctions a campaign that will bring Nicaraguan affairs firmly into the public eye for all the wrong reasons. They are sowing the seeds of one of the greatest political scandals to hit the White House. By 1977, El Salvador has seen right-wing governments replaced with a military junta. Both have ruled with an iron fist, and El Salvador's citizens have had enough.
So many people came to the conclusion that the only way to achieve democracy, the only way to achieve a fairer society, to redistribute wealth, was through the armed struggle. And various guerrilla organizations were formed, and in 1980, 5 of those guerrilla organizations joined together to create the FMLN.
Cuba, the Soviet Union, and Nicaragua. 3 communist states working together to further the interests of a potential 4th. The FMLN soldiers are trained in Cuba, while the Soviet Union sends vessels which are full of guns and ammunition. But the arms have to get into El Salvador without detection by government forces. And that's where Nicaragua comes in.
Under the Carter administration, the CIA starts providing him with a lot of information about that the FSLN is channeling arms to left-wing revolutionaries in El Salvador. And they never have conclusive proof, but at one point Carter feels forced to kind of cut off that aid to the Nicaraguan revolution. So the relationship already starts to break down before Reagan comes to power.
On October the 15th, 1979, 5 decades of right-wing military dictatorship in El Salvador come to an end. President Carlos Romero is ousted in a bloodless coup. But it's not at the hands of the FMLN. Power now rests with a new military leadership. They are promising radical changes to social and economic structures. Still a long way short of the full-scale communist values of the FMLN. In Washington, D.C., they breathe a sigh of relief. Braced for a communist takeover, this feels like a lucky escape. America announces support for this new El Salvadoran administration. Next door in Nicaragua, The new Sandinista regime is causing huge concern to the US government. The Sandinista are assisting the Russians and the Cubans in getting arms to the left-wing rebels in El Salvador. It's also training and supporting them in their fight against the American-backed administration. The US takes action.
Nicaragua for quite some time had been selling sugar to the United States at a price that was higher than the market value of sugar. The Reagan administration, as part of its economic warfare, decided to cut by 90% the amount of sugar that Nicaragua could sell. This, of course, created a sharp decline in revenues for the Nicaraguan government.
And President Reagan doesn't stop there. He convinces Congress to spend American taxes, preventing the flow of arms from Nicaragua to El Salvador.
The initial funding that was approved at the start, really, of the Reagan administration was about $17 million. The Reagan administration later convinced Congress to provide an additional $24 million, but this was done with the understanding from Congress that this money was going into preventing the Sandinistas from transferring weapons to the El Salvador insurgency.
The money goes to fund right-wing revolutionaries, known as the Contras. Not only are they trying to stop the rebels in El Salvador, they want to take out Nicaragua's Sandinista government. President Reagan wants to do everything he can to help them achieve that.
He gets the CIA to start training, equipping and arming the Contras to fight the Sandinistas.
The Contras were initially small groups of armed men. Some of them were connected directly with the former Somoza regime. For example, there were former members of the National Guard, which had been a brutal army in support of the Somoza regime. Others were simply businessmen or people who had a political connection to the Somoza regime, and they decided to leave the country when the Somoza regime fell. And finally, there was a smaller group of what we could define as conservatives who were traditionally opposed to the Somoza regime, but also did not like the idea of staying in Nicaragua with the Sandinistas in power.
These Contras, who are holed up in the border areas of Honduras and Costa Rica, both friendly countries to the USA, will grow to be a force of 15,000 soldiers. Moscow, 1982. Reagan's fears about the Sandinista government are hardened when leader Daniel Ortega is invited to Russia. This visit is seen by the Western world as a coming together of two communist countries. And the real reason for the visit? Ortega is here to ask for economic and military aid.
Brezhnev gives them support in words, and he's obviously happy that there's another revolution happening, but he's quite hesitant to kind of throw his full weight behind the Nicaraguan revolution. Also because he is a bit suspicious of their actual socialist, Marxist-Leninist credentials, because they obviously have been trying to portray themselves very differently.
However, the television pictures beamed around the world suggest Ortega will be successful. In America, Reagan is watching and worrying.
The Sandinista government was certainly receiving some financial support from the Eastern Bloc and from the Soviet Union. Ironically, this financial support certainly increased as the United States started to step up its economic warfare against the government of Nicaragua.
This meeting of communist minds will motivate him to pour yet more resources into the counter-revolutionaries. Ultimately, it will lead him to break the law, creating one of the greatest scandals in American political history, the Iran-Contra affair. In 1982, civil war is raging in El Salvador. As left-wing rebels fight against the ruling military junta, Ronald Reagan's administration is sending $1 million a day to the El Salvadoran government to help keep them in power.
They continued to support the Salvadoran military because they were determined not to let another domino fall, not to let another country go communist as they saw it.
Next door in Nicaragua, America's also spending a fortune. An army of CIA-trained Contras are being funded to stop the left-wing Sandinista government from funneling Soviet and Cuban arms to the El Salvador rebels. But these CIA-trained Contras are doing much more than that.
Once it became clear that the narrative about stopping the flow of weapons no longer worked, the Reagan administration started to adopt a narrative about democracy promotion. They started to build a case, which was very traditional in the Cold War, that the Sandinistas were a communist, totalitarian regime that was depriving the Nicaraguan people of freedom, of rights. And so the Nicaraguan really civil war takes on a much more explicit Cold War rationale and Cold War tones, in which you have the allegedly freedom-loving Contras fighting against a totalitarian regime in Managua that is depriving the people of liberties.
But some members of Congress start to get suspicious about what's really going on.
We have a couple of episodes in which congressmen actually travel to Central America, to the Contras training camp in Honduras and to certain areas in Nicaragua, and they can see that the story that the Reagan administration is telling Congress and the American people is not necessarily true. The Contras are perhaps more violent than the Reagan administration is admitting. And to a large extent, they can see that the Contras do not have the type of support in Nicaragua that would permit them to provide an alternative political agenda to that of the Sandinistas.
Following 2 years of undisputed funds from Congress, there is now uneasiness about what the money is paying for. In El Salvador, American-trained troops have killed civilians in their raids. There is a feeling that US involvement in the region is spiraling out of control.
The United States trained and worked with the Salvadoran military, who used the most brutal methods, but also it was quite clear that they worked with the death squads. And the US continued to support the Salvadoran military, even as evidence came out of horrific human rights abuses, of massacres, of kidnappings, of rapes.
Public opinion is turning against American taxes being used to fight this proxy Cold War. In December 1982, a Democratic member of Congress, Senator Edward P. Boland, suggests an amendment to the next set of monies to Central America.
You get a new Democratic Congress and it says, you know what, Mr. President, we really don't think the CIA should be operating in Nicaragua. We actually think more generally the CIA should not be meddling in foreign conflicts overseas. So we're going to pass something called the Boland Agreement, which prohibits exactly what's been going on over the last few years.
This so-called Boland Amendment is passed by both houses. It forbids funds to be given to the Contras for the purpose of trying to overthrow the Sandinista government. However, it still allows money to be given to stop the flow of weapons into El Salvador. This turns out to be a major loophole. Throughout 1982 and 83, the situation in Nicaragua worsens as the CIA continues to help the Contras in secret.
The CIA actually helped the Contras carrying out attacks on vital infrastructure like oil pipelines, ports, Nicaragua's harbors.
Back in Congress, patience is running out with the CIA and its director, William Casey.
Even the Republicans on the intelligence committees were enraged with Casey, specifically for the fact that he had tried to hide this operation. And it is the mining of the Nicaraguan harbors that, to a large extent, lead to the second Boland Amendment, which explicitly cut off any possibility of funding for the Contras provided by US agencies involved in intelligences, including the CIA and the Department of Defense. In theory, this should have stopped any financial support for the Contras.
President Reagan still wants to overthrow the Sandinistas. Now, he has to do it in secret, and it's not the only covert operation he's plotting. Some of Reagan's counter-terrorism chiefs are helping him figure out how to get American hostages out of Lebanon. Since 1982, state-sponsored Iranian terrorists have been kidnapping Westerners. This includes several US citizens and a CIA chief of staff. National Security Council staffer, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, is looking at ways of trying to establish exactly where the hostages are.
One of the tools they develop is something called the Eagle program. It is a small drone that has explosives and small rockets attached to it, and the plan is to use this weapon to track down terrorist leaders and individuals and to kill them.
While these plans are being developed, Reagan is desperate to get back some American hostages being held in Lebanon by Iranian terrorists. There's about to be a very timely request that might just help with that. Iran are at war with Iraq, and they need weapons. In 1985, they asked to buy American-made armaments. An arms embargo forbids this deal from happening, but Reagan and his national security advisor, Robert Bud McFarlane, plot to circumvent it. They think they can sell Iran arms in exchange for the release of hostages. They also believe they can do it covertly. Over 1985 and 1986, the US secretly sells arms to Iran via intermediaries. But only 3 hostages are released, and during this time, 3 more are taken. Several are killed. From a diplomatic point of view, the whole transaction is a disaster, and the public are about to hear all about it. In November 1986, Lebanese newspaper Al-Shara exposes the arms for hostages activities. Unsurprisingly, there is public outrage. Reagan initially denies it has ever happened. While he retracts this a week later, he continues to say the arms were not sold in exchange for hostages. Attorney General Edwin Meese starts to investigate. What he finds is explosive. Not only is the cash for hostages allegation true, there is yet another clandestine and illegal deal at the center of it. He discovers it by following the money. Iran has paid $30 million for the American missiles and weapons. But curiously, the Pentagon receives just $12 million of that. Where are the missing millions? The discrepancy is explained by Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. This national security member says he diverted the missing $18 million to the Contras in Nicaragua.
This became the famous Iran-Contra scandal, in which the United States, contravening its own rules about not providing weapons to states supporting terrorism, decided to sell weapons to alleged Iranian moderates in the hope that they might help free US hostages detained in the Middle East. This was the Iran side of Iran-Contra. North decided to overcharge the Iranians in the sale of these weapons and to use the additional funds from these sale of weapons to be transferred to Swiss bank accounts and eventually used for the support of the Contras.
Did Reagan know about this? Speculation about his and Vice President Bush's knowledge and involvement was rife. Oliver North and others involved are fired. The innovative pilotless aircraft idea they had backed perishes on their departure. And the company that is working on it files for bankruptcy a few years later. But there's a twist in this tale with a Nicaraguan dimension. Around the same time, two American brothers are also trying to develop a drone.
Two wealthy American entrepreneurs, the Blue brothers, they had sought the development of a pilotless drone that could be used to destroy oil reserves and pipelines in Nicaragua. They had a close connection. They had owned a fruit ripening farm in Nicaragua. In their younger years, they were ardent cold warriors, anti-communists. They were incensed that a communist government ran this country, and they wanted to use their wealth to do something about it.
The breaking of the Iran-Contra affair scotches their plans. But the idea doesn't go away, and the Blue brothers buy the company who were developing Oliver North's army drone. They get in early on what is to be a flourishing industry. Today, as owners of General Atomic, they supply a quarter of the drone market.
Were it not for the funding of the Contras and the illegal activities there, these individuals would not have got together to create these ideas of aggressive neutralization of terrorists.
And in Central America, the Americans were already practicing and perfecting techniques in how to deceive. Not just on the ground, in covert military operations, but in their propaganda campaigns to win hearts and minds. Keeping the communists out of America required more than tanks and bombs. It needed fake news. And the CIA was at the heart of it. In 1981, El Salvador is ruled by a right-wing American-backed government who are determined to stamp out any idea of an uprising. El Mozote is a village in the Morazan department of El Salvador, home to around 1,000 people, peasants who mainly work on the land. Here, in December 1981, right-wing government forces carry out a raid. They're looking for members of the FMLN, the left-wing rebels fighting against the military junta in power. No one can imagine the horrific crimes they will commit.
The massacre of El Mozote came to light when journalists, particularly foreign journalists, visited the site. A reporter from the New York Times reported that he'd seen charred skulls, charred bones of numerous bodies, and he wrote a report on this. The Washington Post wrote a report. And so gradually news began to filter out in the international media, but the State Department denied all knowledge of it. One of the reasons why the US wanted to cover up this horrific massacre is because the battalion responsible had been created in the US Army School of the Americas.
But in 1981, America denies any wrongdoing. President Reagan says there is no evidence the Mozote atrocity occurred. Next door in Nicaragua, as well as financing the right-wing Contra rebels, the US administration is teaching them the art of subterfuge. In 1984, it's reported that a CIA manual is doing the rounds amongst the Contras.
This book really, we would describe it as nothing more than state-sponsored terrorism. It's a guide produced by the CIA which encourages public killings and assassinations. It encourages attacks upon court judges, police officials, with public witnesses for the impact of intimidating citizens and bringing down the government. And actually this particular guide to guerrilla warfare is leaked. It sees light and creates quite a controversy for the administration. So even before the Iran-Contra affair highlights just the extent of illegal activity taking place in Central America, this is already starting to raise questions and concerns.
At home too, Reagan sets out to manipulate information about what is happening in Central America. To do so, he was employing the expertise of some surprising professionals. In 1983, National Security Council Director William Casey calls a meeting. He invites along several top advertising executives. He wants their advice on how to sell a new product. That product? Central America.
There is a broader effort within Washington to present the Contras as freedom fighters. Reagan is very often seen, for example, with T-shirts asking for support for the Contras. And the rhetoric surrounding the Contras as freedom fighters, of course, plays on American myth of insurgents fighting against a tyrannical regime like that of the Sandinistas.
On March the 2nd, 1985, Reagan said the Contras were the moral equivalent of the Founding Fathers. In contrast, Sandinista rule in Nicaragua is referred to as a totalitarian dungeon. The CIA dramatically sexes up papers and information about Nicaragua. When investigated, they often turn out to be grossly exaggerated. But by then, the seed has been planted in the American psyche. The damage has been done.
The Reagan administration picked up some stories that a group of Jews had left Nicaragua as soon as the Sandinistas had gotten into power. And this was very much used as a demonstration that the Sandinistas were by nature anti-Semitic. What the story failed to mention was that these groups were actually former members or former supporters of the Somoza regime, and that was the reason why they left the country, not any of the policies done by the Sandinistas.
So seriously is this PR battle taken, the State Department sets up a whole new section to sell Central America.
It's set up a so-called Office of Public Diplomacy, headed by Otto Reich, a member of the Reagan administration. And that Office of Public Diplomacy published pro-Contra books. It organised experts to give press conferences, to give speeches. It placed articles in mainstream newspapers supporting the Contras without making it clear that these were being funded by the US government.
Taxpayer-funded, this is a white propaganda operation.
Inevitably, one of the consequences of the CIA flooding the news cycles around the world with this propaganda material is a concern of blowback. That material will eventually end up finding its way to American journalists. It's a consequence the CIA was well aware of, but it's a risk they decide is worth taking in order to control news cycles in a positive, pro-American way elsewhere around the world.
They consult with psychological warfare specialists, learning how to play with and manage the views of the American people. Otto Reich was the chair of the Office for Public Diplomacy in Latin America and the Caribbean. He was letting no one get in the way of his key message.
Otto Reich was very much at the forefront of this operation, often threatening journalists or pushing and imposing stories on journalists, and criticizing and sometimes blackmailing journalists who had published critical stories against the Contras or that were critical of the Reagan administration policy towards Central America.
Polls and information on public opinion are closely evaluated, then used to deliver palatable messages to receptive ears. One concern noted was that the war could cause Nicaraguan refugees to come to America. Shortly after, Reagan gives a speech on how, if the forces of the left remain unchecked, they would cause a refugee flow. Only by siding with the good guys, Reagan's guys, can this tsunami of Latin American visitors be stopped. Their strategy was as blunt and as brilliant as that. This is a war fought on many fronts.
The US Comptroller's Office censured Otto Reich and the Office of Public Diplomacy, saying it was illegal, that it had been using US public funds to carry out propaganda on behalf of the Contras.
Ultimately, with his arsenal of real and psychological weapons, Reagan wins the war on communism in Nicaragua.
By the late 80s, when the Contra affair blew up, the Reagan administration had actually achieved its aim in the sense that people in Nicaragua were absolutely exhausted with war. Almost every family knew someone who'd been killed or maimed in the Contra War.
Daniel Ortega and the Sandinistas get voted out in the Nicaraguan elections in 1990.
And they lost those elections primarily because people were exhausted with war, and they felt that if they voted for the Sandinistas, the US would continue to wage this war on Nicaragua.
We have some evidence that this campaign of economic warfare was actually more important in the eventual downfall of the Sandinistas and in their electoral defeat in the 1990s than what the Contras had done militarily. The economic warfare campaign had increased poverty and increased deprivation in Nicaragua, and thus damaged the regime and the credibility of the Sandinista regime.
The Sandinistas, which the Reagan administration had painted as totalitarian communists, they held elections, they lost elections, and they left office. The first peaceful transfer of power in Nicaragua's history.
Nicaragua moves into a new chapter. In El Salvador, the government and the rebels sign a peace accord in 1992, bringing a decade of civil war to an end. But for these Central American countries, there has been no happy ending. At the same time as the soldiers responsible for the El Mozote massacre are finally brought to justice, El Salvador is devastated by violence and crime. The wounds and pain caused by the civil war show no signs of healing. And in the whole region, there is little hope that the next generation will be better off.
Now you have Central America today with incredibly high levels of poverty, very high levels of violence, urban violence, a large number of people in the countryside with no land, and sprawling shanty towns in the cities. Gang violence is rife. Many young men feel that the only way to survive is either to join a gang or to migrate.
America has spent billions of pounds in the region, but only to further its own interests. None of it is to help the people living in poverty. In Nicaragua and El Salvador, successive governments have failed to redistribute wealth and bring peace and prosperity to its citizens. It remains to be seen if Central America can shake off the legacies the world's superpowers have left them and create a brighter future for everyone in the region.